What if I told you that the very thing you fear most, the thing that makes you question whether you're doing something wrong, the thing that creates that hollow feeling in your chest when you walk away from conversation where you felt utterly unseen, is actually the first signal that you're becoming real? Not the kind of real that fits into the world's expectations, but the kind of real that your soul has been whispering toward since you were a child, before you learned to translate yourself into something more digestible, more acceptable, more easily categorized by those who never learned to look past surfaces. There's a particular kind of loneliness that arrives not when you're isolated, but when you're standing in a room full of people who think they know you, and you realize that the person they're responding to, the one they're laughing with or nodding at or even arguing against, isn't you at all. It's a shape you've been holding, a familiar echo of old agreements about who you were supposed to be, and somewhere in the recent past, without announcing it even to yourself, you stopped fitting inside that shape quite so neatly. The edges started to show. The seams began to pull. And now, when you speak from that place that feels more true, more aligned with something you can't quite name but can definitely feel, people look at you with a slight confusion, a barely perceptible pause before they respond, as if they're trying to locate the version of you they recognize and finding only a stranger wearing your face. This isn't failure. This isn't a sign that you've lost your ability to communicate or that you've somehow broken the social contract that keeps human beings tethered to one another in understanding. What's happening is far more profound and far more ancient than a simple miscommunication. You are in the process of removing a mask you didn't even know you were wearing, a mask so familiar, so practiced, so deeply embedded in your daily expressions and responses that it became indistinguishable from your face. And now, as it begins to loosen, as you begin to speak and move and choose from a place that isn't performing for an invisible audience, the people who knew the mask are experiencing a dissonance they can't quite articulate. They're not seeing you more clearly. They're seeing that their previous clarity was an illusion, a comfortable agreement that you would remain a known quantity, and now you're becoming unknown again, which is to say, you're becoming yourself. Carl Jung spent much of his life mapping the territories of the psyche, not as a distant observer, but as someone who had walked through his own descent into the unknown parts of himself. He understood that we all were what he called the persona, the social mask we present to the world, and that this mask serves a function. It allows us to navigate social structures, to fulfill roles, to meet expectations without constantly negotiating our authentic complexity in every interaction. But Jung also knew that there comes a moment in many lives, often in the middle years, but sometimes earlier, sometimes later, when the persona begins to feel like a prison rather than a tool. The self underneath, the deeper organizing principle of who we actually are, begins to push against the constraints of the mask. It doesn't do this through dramatic rebellion or conscious decision, at least not at first. It does this through subtle discomfort, through a growing sense that the words coming out of your mouth don't quite match the feeling in your chest, through a creeping awareness that you're exhausted not from doing too much, but from being someone that requires constant maintenance and adjustment. And when you begin, often without fully realizing it, to let that mask slip, to speak from the self rather than the persona, the world responds with confusion because you've changed the unspoken agreement. In this exploration, I want to walk with you through the signs that this process is underway, not so that you can stop or control it, but so that you can recognize it for what it is, a necessary unfolding, a return to something more essential. And I want to suggest that the very thing that might be causing you anxiety right now, the sense that you're being misunderstood more often, that your words are landing differently, that people seem puzzled by choices that feel utterly clear to you, these are not signs that you're losing yourself. They're signs that you're finding yourself. And that process, that return, always looks like strangeness to those who are still committed to the familiar version of who you were. So stay with me here. Let these words settle not just in your mind, but in your body, in that place that already knows what I'm describing because it's been living it quietly in the margins of your days. The first sign that you're leaving the familiar mask behind is this persistent sense that your words are being misinterpreted, not occasionally, not in isolated moments of confusion, but regularly, almost predictably. You say something that feels simple and clear to you, something that arises from your actual feeling or perception or need, and the person across from you responds to something you didn't say. They argue against a point you weren't making. They comfort you for a sadness you're not feeling. They celebrate a victory you don't experience as victorious. And you find yourself in this strange position of having to translate yourself, to backtrack and clarify and rephrase, except that no amount of rephrasing seems to bridge the gap, because the gap isn't linguistic. The gap is ontological. You're speaking from a different ground of being than you were 6 months ago, a year ago, 5 years ago, and the people who learn to interpret you based on that old ground are still listening for the familiar frequencies. They're still expecting you to mean what you used to mean when you used those same words. Let me give you an example that might land in your actual experience. Maybe you've recently told someone close to you that you need more time alone, more space to think, more silence in your days. And this person, who cares about you, who wants to understand you, immediately interprets this as depression, as withdrawal, as a problem to be solved. They ask if you're okay. They suggest activities to pull you out of your isolation. They express concern that you're cutting yourself off from connection. And you find yourself in the exhausting position of trying to explain that your need for solitude isn't a symptom of disconnection, but a symptom of finally connecting to something deeper in yourself, something that requires quiet to be heard. But this explanation doesn't quite land either, because to them, the old you, the you they're still relating to, would have only retreated into solitude when something was wrong. The old you used noise and activity and constant company as a way to avoid feeling. So when you now choose silence, they can only interpret it through the old pattern. They can't see that the pattern has shifted, that you've shifted, that what used to be avoidance is now approach, that you're moving toward something rather than away from something. But the something you're moving toward isn't visible to them because it's internal, it's subtle, it's not yet fully formed even in your own understanding. Or maybe it's in your work, in the way you talk about your ambitions, or lack thereof. Perhaps you've spent years climbing a particular ladder, pursuing a particular definition of success, and recently you've noticed that the drive has changed. Not disappeared, but changed in quality. You're less interested in impressing, less motivated by external validation, more drawn to projects that feel meaningful in a way you can't quite articulate to others. And when you try to explain this shift to colleagues or family members who knew you as ambitious in the old way, they hear it as giving up, as settling, as a loss of drive. They might even express disappointment or concern, trying to motivate you back into the version of ambition they recognize. And you feel this strange split, this sense that you're actually more aligned, more purposeful than you've ever been. But that purpose is invisible to people who are still measuring success by metrics you've quietly stopped caring about. The misunderstanding here isn't about the facts of what you're doing. It's about the meaning structure underneath the doing. You've changed the meaning, and meaning is invisible until it manifests in choices. And by the time it manifests in choices, people have already decided what those choices mean based on who you used to be. This kind of misunderstanding creates a particular kind of loneliness. It's not the loneliness of being alone. It's the loneliness of being with people who think they're with you, but who are actually with a memory of you, a projection of you, a version of you that you've already grown beyond, but haven't yet fully separated from in their eyes. And this loneliness has a weight to it, a heaviness that sits in your chest, or your throat, or your stomach, depending on where your body holds relational tension. You might notice that after certain conversations, you feel drained not because the conversation was difficult, but because you spent the entire time managing the gap between who you are now and who they need you to be for them to feel comfortable. You were translating yourself in real time, editing your actual responses to fit into the shape they could receive, and that constant translation is exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. Jung would say that this is the tension between the persona and the self, between the role you've been playing and the deeper identity that's emerging. The persona is collective. It's shaped by family expectations, cultural norms, social roles, the internalized voices of authority figures from your past. The self is individual. It's the unique organizing principle of your particular psyche, the pattern that wants to unfold through your life, the person you would become if you weren't constantly adjusting to fit external demands. And the journey from persona to self is not a smooth transition. It's a process of disidentification, of slowly loosening your attachment to the familiar ways you've defined yourself and the familiar ways others have defined you. And during this process, you become less legible to the people who knew the persona version of you. You become strange. You become misunderstood. And this is not a bug in the process. This is the process itself. You can't become more yourself without becoming less recognizable to those who only knew the mask. But here's what makes this so difficult, so disorienting, so easy to misinterpret as a personal failure. The people who are misunderstanding you are not doing it maliciously. They're not trying to trap you in an old identity. They're simply responding to you based on the patterns they've learned, the agreements you've implicitly made over years or decades of relationship. You train them, in a sense, to expect certain responses from you, to interpret your behavior through certain lenses, and now you're changing the lens without having explicitly announced that you're changing the lens. How could you announce it? You're barely aware of it yourself. The change is happening at a level deeper than conscious decision. It's happening in your values, your desires, your sense of what matters. And these things shift slowly, subtly, until one day you realize that you're standing in a completely different inner landscape than you were a year ago, but everyone around you is still using the old map. So you have a choice, and it's not an easy choice. You can spend your energy trying to make yourself understood, trying to bring everyone along with you into this new territory, trying to explain and justify and clarify until they see you the way you're starting to see yourself. Or you can accept that for a while, maybe for a long while, you're going to be misunderstood, and that this misunderstanding is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived through. You can let people have their confusion. You can let them hold their version of you, while you continue to discover the version of you that's emerging. You can stop translating quite so much, stop editing quite so carefully, and simply speak from where you actually are, knowing that some of it will land and some of it won't, and that the landing or not landing isn't a reflection of your worth or your clarity, but simply a reflection of the gap between where you are and where they are, and that gap is okay. It's allowed. It's part of the process of differentiation, of becoming a separate self, rather than an extension of collective expectations. There's a particular kind of freedom that comes when you stop needing to be understood by everyone. It's not the freedom of isolation or indifference. It's the freedom of self-trust. It's the ability to know what you mean, to know what you feel, to know what you need, even when no one around you reflects that knowing back to you. It's the ability to hold your own experience as valid without requiring external validation to confirm it. And this is a maturity that doesn't come from trying to achieve it. It comes from being forced into it by the very process we're describing. When you're constantly misunderstood, you have to develop an internal reference point. You have to learn to trust your own perception, your own feeling, your own sense of what's true for you, because the external mirrors are no longer reliable. They're reflecting the old you, and you're no longer that person. So the reflection creates dissonance rather than confirmation. And here's where it gets even more interesting, even more layered. As you begin to trust your own internal sense of things more, as you begin to speak from that place without constantly checking whether it's being received correctly, something shifts in the quality of your presence. You become more solid, more grounded, more here. Not louder, not more aggressive, not more insistent, just more present. Because you're not splitting your attention between what you're actually experiencing and how you think you should be experiencing it to make sense to others. You're just here in your actual experience, and that quality of presence is magnetic in a way that the persona never was. The persona was likable, acceptable, easy to be around. But this new presence, this emerging self, is real. And real has a gravity to it that likable doesn't. Real draws certain people closer and pushes other people away, and both of those movements are necessary. The second sign that you're leaving the familiar mask is that you're starting to lose interest in explaining yourself, even when misunderstanding creates tension or distance. There was a time, maybe not so long ago, when being misunderstood felt intolerable. It created an immediate urgency in you to clarify, to correct, to make sure the other person saw your intention, understood your meaning, recognized that you're not who they think you are in that moment. And you would spend hours, sometimes days, turning over a conversation in your mind, crafting better explanations, imagining what you should have said to make yourself clear. But recently, maybe so recently that you're just now noticing it, that urgency has started to fade. Someone misinterprets your words or your actions, and instead of that immediate need to fix it, to rush in with clarification. You feel something else. Maybe it's a quiet acceptance. Maybe it's a mild curiosity about why they heard it that way. Maybe it's even a kind of relief, a sense that you don't actually have to manage their perception of you, that their perception is theirs to hold and yours to release. This shift is subtle but profound. It's not that you become indifferent to being understood. It's that you've started to recognize the difference between being understood and being seen, and you've started to realize that being understood by someone who's still relating to your old self isn't actually being seen at all. It's being fit into a familiar category, being made sense of through old patterns, and that kind of understanding actually prevents real seeing. Real seeing requires that the other person is willing to not know you for a moment, to let their assumptions fall away, to meet you as you are now rather than as you were. And that's rare. That requires a kind of presence and openness that most people, including you, including me, can only sustain in brief moments. So most of the time, we're all relating to each other through layers of assumption and projection and memory. And most of the time, that's fine. That's how human relationship works. But when you're in the process of significant interchange, when the self is emerging from behind the persona, those layers of assumption become obstacles rather than bridges. And so you start to let go. Not dramatically, not through confrontation or announcement. You just stop spending quite so much energy trying to correct every misperception. Someone says something about you that isn't quite right, and instead of jumping in to adjust their view, you let it sit. You let them have their version. You notice the discomfort that arises in you, the old habit that wants to manage and control and fix, and you breathe into that discomfort and let it be. And what you discover, slowly, is that their misunderstanding of you doesn't actually change who you are. It doesn't diminish your experience or invalidate your perception. It's just their view, and they're entitled to their view, and you're entitled to know something different, and both of those things can be true at the same time without creating a crisis. This is a kind of emotional maturity that our culture doesn't talk about much because our culture is obsessed with being understood, with effective communication, with making sure everyone is on the same page. And those things have their place. But there's a deeper maturity that comes from recognizing that you will never be fully understood by another person because full understanding would require them to be you. To have your history, your nervous system, your particular constellation of experiences and sensitivities and wounds and gifts. And since that's impossible, since we're all fundamentally separate, understanding is always partial, always filtered through the other person's lens. And that's okay. That's not a tragedy. That's just the condition of being human, of being an individual consciousness trying to communicate with another individual consciousness across the gap of separateness. Jung wrote about the process of individuation, the journey of becoming who you actually are, and he was clear that this journey is not about becoming more connected to the collective. It's about becoming more differentiated from the collective. It's about discovering what in you is truly yours versus what you've absorbed from family, culture, zeitgeist. And that process of differentiation necessarily creates distance. It creates moments where you're standing apart from the group, holding a perception or a value or a need that doesn't match the consensus, and you have to decide whether to adjust yourself back into alignment with the group or to hold your ground and accept the discomfort of being the outlier. And every time you choose to hold your ground, every time you let yourself be misunderstood rather than contorting to be understood, you're strengthening your relationship with your own self. You're saying, in effect, I trust my experience more than I need your validation of my experience. And that's not arrogance. That's self-possession. That's the beginning of real authority, the kind that doesn't need to dominate or convince, the kind that simply knows itself and is willing to be known slowly, over time, by those who are patient enough and present enough to look beyond first impressions. You might notice this shift showing up in small ways. Maybe someone makes an assumption about your political views or your lifestyle choices based on one comment you made. And instead of launching into a detailed explanation of your actual nuanced position, you just let them have their assumption. You offer a small smile, a non-committal sound, and you change the subject. Or maybe you're in a family gathering and someone brings up an old story about you, a story that casts you in a role you no longer identify with, the rebel or the peacemaker or the responsible one or the flaky one. And instead of correcting the narrative, instead of saying that's not who I am anymore, you just let the story exist. You let them have their memory. because you're starting to understand that their memory of who you were is part of their story, not yours, and you don't need to edit their story to be free of it. This can feel like a kind of loneliness too, this letting go of the need to be understood, because there's a part of us that believes deeply that being understood is the same as being loved. That if people really see us, really get us, that's proof that we matter, that we belong, that we're not alone in the universe. And so, when we stop trying to make people understand us, it can feel like we're giving up on connection, like we're resigning ourselves to isolation. But what's actually happening is more subtle and more profound. We're shifting from a dependent kind of connection, where we need the other person to mirror us back to ourselves in order to know who we are, to a more mature kind of connection, where we know who we are independent of their mirroring, and we can connect with them from that ground of self-knowledge rather than from a place of need. And that kind of connection is deeper, more real, more sustainable, because it's not based on the other person performing a particular role in our psychic economy. It's based on two people who know themselves meeting each other in the space between, without collapsing into fusion or codependence. But this shift doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without grief. There's a grief in realizing that some people will never understand the person you're becoming. There's a grief in watching relationships that were built on the old version of you start to strain or fade as you grow into something new. There's a grief in recognizing that you can't bring everyone with you, that some people are meant to be part of one chapter of your life and not the next, and that this is not a failure on anyone's part, but simply the natural consequence of growth and change. And you have to let yourself feel that grief. You have to let yourself mourn the version of connection you thought you'd have, the fantasy that everyone who mattered to you would be able to see you and celebrate you and understand you as you evolve. Because that fantasy, as beautiful as it is not how human development actually works. Growth creates distance. Change creates misunderstanding. Becoming yourself means becoming strange to those who only knew the mask. And that's painful. And the pain is part of the process. You don't bypass it. You don't spiritually bypass it by telling yourself that anyone who doesn't understand you isn't meant to be in your life. You feel it, you honor it, and you keep moving. The third sign is that you're starting to feel more comfortable with silence, with not filling every gap, with letting conversations end without resolution or closure. This might seem like a small thing, almost trivial compared to the larger themes we've been exploring, but it's actually deeply connected. The old you, the persona version, was often performing a kind of social maintenance, making sure everyone was comfortable, making sure the energy in the room stayed light or productive or harmonious, making sure that awkward silences were filled with something, anything, to ease the tension. And this wasn't necessarily inauthentic. It came from a genuine care for others, a genuine desire to create connection and ease. But it also came from a place of anxiety, a fear that if you weren't actively managing the social field, something bad would happen. People would judge you. People would feel uncomfortable and blame you for that discomfort. The relationship would fracture. And so you learn to be hypervigilant, hyper-responsive, always reading the room, always adjusting your energy to match or balance or soothe whatever was happening around you. But as you begin to shed the mask, as you begin to inhabit yourself more fully, that hypervigilance starts to feel exhausting in a new way. It's not just tiring, it's false. It's a betrayal of something in you that wants to be still, that wants to simply be present without performing presence. And so you start to experiment, maybe without even consciously deciding to, with letting the silence be. Someone says something, and instead of immediately responding, you pause. You take a breath. You let the words land in you and see what actually wants to come back, rather than what you think should come back. And sometimes what wants to come back is nothing. Sometimes the most honest response is silence, is a nod, is a look that says, I hear you, but I don't have words for this right now. And you let that be enough. This is deeply uncomfortable at first, especially if you've built your relational identity on being articulate, on being the one who can always find the right words, on being the one who bridges gaps and smooths over tensions. Silence feels like failure. It feels like you're letting people down, like you're not holding up your end of the social contract. And you can see the discomfort in others too. They look at you expectantly. They wait for you to fill the space. And when you don't, when you just sit there in your own quietness, they might prompt you. They might ask if you're okay. They might fill the silence themselves. rushing in with more words to cover the awkwardness. And you let them. You don't explain. You don't apologize. You just stay in your silence, in your not knowing, in your refusal to perform ease when ease isn't what you're actually feeling. What you're discovering, slowly, is that silence is not empty. Silence is full. It's full of presence, of awareness, of the unspoken currents that run underneath all our words. And when you stop filling the silence with automatic responses, with scripted pleasantries, with the persona's well-rehearsed lines, you start to hear those currents. You start to feel what's actually happening in the space between you and the other person. You start to notice the subtle energies, the unspoken tensions, the places where something real wants to emerge but can't because there's no space for it, because the space is always already filled with noise. And so you create space. You offer silence. And sometimes that silence is received as a gift, as an invitation for the other person to also drop their performance and just be. And sometimes that silence is received as rejection, as coldness, as evidence that you've become distant or disconnected. And you can't control which way it's received. You can only offer what's true for you in that moment and let the other person make of it what they will. Jung spoke about the importance of holding tension, of not rushing to resolve contradictions or ambiguities, of allowing the psyche to sit in the discomfort of not knowing until something new emerges. He called this the transcendent function, the process by which the psyche integrates opposites and births a new perspective that couldn't have been reached through logic or willpower alone. And this process requires silence. It requires space. It requires that you stop trying to figure everything out, stop trying to manage and control and fix, and simply be present to what is, even when what is feels uncomfortable or unclear or unresolved. And as you practice this internally, as you learn to sit with your own inner silence and ambiguity, you naturally begin to bring that capacity into your relationships. You become someone who can hold space for uncomfortable truths, for unanswered questions, for the gaps between words where the real meaning lives. And this changes the quality of your connections. Some people are drawn to this new quality in you. They feel safer with you, more able to be themselves, because you're not rushing to fix or explain or smooth over. You're just there, present, holding space for whatever wants to emerge. These are often the people who are also in their own process of shedding masks, who are also learning to trust their inner experience, and they recognize in you a kind of permission to be real. But other people are uncomfortable with this new quality. They experience your silence as judgment or withdrawal. They miss the old you who was always ready with a response, always available to ease their discomfort, always willing to play the role they needed you to play. And they might pull away, or they might push harder, trying to get you to go back to being the person they're comfortable with. And this is where you have to make a choice over and over again. Do you go back to the mask to keep the peace? Or do you stay in your truth and let the relationship evolve, or end as it needs to? There's no right answer to that question. Or rather, the right answer is different in each situation, with each person, at each moment. Sometimes the loving thing to do is to offer a little bit of the old performance, to meet someone where they are because they're going through something difficult and they need the familiar version of you to lean on. And sometimes the loving thing, both for them and for you, is to hold your ground, to stay in your silence, to refuse to go back to a way of being that no longer fits you. The wisdom is in knowing the difference, in being able to discern when flexibility is generosity and when flexibility is self-betrayal. And that discernment doesn't come from a rule or a principle. It comes from being deeply connected to your own inner sense, your own felt experience, your own knowing that lives below the level of thought. You might notice that as you become more comfortable with silence, with not explaining, with not filling every gap, you also become more comfortable with mystery, with not having everything figured out, with letting your life unfold without needing to narrate it constantly to yourself or others. There's a way that constant explanation, constant storytelling, constant meaning-making can actually be a defense against the rawness of experience. If you can explain it, if you can fit it into a narrative, if you can make sense of it, then you don't have to feel the full weight of it, the full strangeness of it, the full not knowing of it. But when you stop explaining quite so much, when you let experiences just be experiences without immediately converting them into stories, You open yourself to a different kind of knowing, a knowing that comes through the body, through sensation, through the wordless awareness that precedes and exceeds language. This is the knowing that Jung was pointing toward when he talked about the unconscious, about the parts of ourselves that we can't access through rational thought, that only reveal themselves through symbols, through dreams, through the body's wisdom, through the synchronicities that seem to organize our lives in patterns we can't quite explain, but can definitely feel. And as you become more comfortable with silence, with not knowing, with mystery, you become more available to this kind of knowing. You start to notice the patterns. You start to trust the intuitions. You start to follow the subtle pulls and nudges that don't make logical sense, but that feel true in a deeper way. And this is where the journey gets really interesting, because you're no longer living according to a script, no longer following a map laid out by family or culture or the persona's internalized rules. You're navigating by feel, by inner sense, by a kind of knowing that can't be justified or explained, but that guides you nonetheless. And of course, this makes you even more incomprehensible to people who are still living by the old maps, who are still making decisions based on external metrics of success or appropriateness or safety. They look at your choices and they don't make sense. They ask you why you're doing what you're doing, and you don't have a good answer, or the answer you have sounds vague or mystical or naive. And so they worry. They question. They try to talk you back into the familiar territory. And you let them have their worry. You let them have their questions. You don't need to convince them. You don't need to make your inner knowing legible to their outer logic. You just keep following the thread, trusting that it's leading you somewhere, even if you can't see where yet. The fourth sign, and this one might be the most disorienting, is that you're starting to attract different kinds of misunderstanding than you used to. It's not just that people don't get you. It's that they're projecting things onto you that feel completely foreign to who you are. Maybe people are seeing you as more confident than you feel, or more detached than you intend, or more spiritual, or intellectual, or emotional than you identify with. It's as if, in shedding the old mask, you've created a kind of blank space where people are now projecting their own unmet needs, their own shadows, their own fantasies of who they want you to be or who they fear you're becoming. And this is deeply strange because you're not trying to be mysterious. You're actually trying to be more real, more authentic, more yourself. But in the gap between who you were and who you're becoming, there's a kind of ambiguity, and human beings are meaning-making creatures. We can't tolerate ambiguity for long. We have to fill it with something. And so people fill the ambiguity of your transition with their own projections. Jung would say that this is inevitable. He would say that we're always projecting, always seeing parts of our own psyche in others, especially in people who are close to us or who matter to us or who are going through changes that stir something in our own unconscious. And when someone is in the process of individuation, when they're becoming more themselves and less defined by collective expectations, they become a kind of screen onto which others project their own unlived potential or their own fear transformation. If you're becoming more free, people who feel trapped might project their resentment onto you. If you're becoming more inner-directed, people who are still seeking external validation might project their judgment onto you. If you're becoming more comfortable with solitude, people who fear aloneness might project their worry onto you, seeing your solitude as evidence of depression or dysfunction rather than as a chosen path of self-discovery. And here's where it gets tricky. Some of these projections might contain a grain of truth. Maybe you are becoming more detached, but not in the way they mean it. Maybe you are becoming more confident, but it's not the kind of confidence that seeks to dominate or impress. Maybe you are becoming more spiritual, but it's not the kind of spirituality that fits into conventional religious frameworks. So when people name what they see in you, it's not entirely wrong, but it's also not entirely right. It's their interpretation of something real, filtered through their own lens, their own fears, their own desires. And you're left in this strange position of trying to discern what's actually true about you versus what's being projected onto you. And that discernment is exhausting because it requires you to hold your own center while also being open to feedback, to hold your own knowing while also being willing to see your blind spots. This is where a lot of people get stuck. They either become too rigid, too defended, dismissing all external feedback as projection and losing the opportunity to learn and grow from others' perceptions. Or they become too porous, too willing to take on others' interpretations as truth, and they lose themselves again, this time not to the old mask, but to a new set of projections that are just as false. The path through this is narrow. It requires that you develop a very strong relationship with your own inner sense of truth, your own felt experience of who you are, while also remaining humble enough to consider that you might have blind spots, that you might be in denial about something, that someone else's perception might be revealing something you're not yet ready to see. And there's no formula for this. It's a moment-by-moment practice of checking in with yourself, of feeling into whether a particular piece of feedback resonates or not, of being willing to sit with discomfort without immediately accepting or rejecting what's being reflected back to you. I remember, and maybe you have a memory like this too, a time when someone said something about me that felt completely off, completely not me, and my immediate reaction was defensive. I wanted to correct them, to explain how wrong they were, to set the record straight. But something in me, some quieter voice, suggested that I just sit with it for a while, that I let their words land without immediately reacting. And when I did that, when I gave it some space, I realized that there was a tiny seed of truth in what they said, but it was buried under layers of their own stuff, their own projection, their own interpretation. And that tiny seed was actually useful to me. It pointed to something I was beginning to explore in myself, but hadn't fully acknowledged yet. But if I had just taken their whole interpretation as truth, I would have distorted myself to fit their perception. And if I had completely dismissed it as projection, I would have missed the seed. So I had to do this delicate dance of taking in what was useful and letting go of what wasn't. And that dance required me to know myself well enough to discern the difference. As you go through this process, as you shed the mask and become more yourself, you're going to receive a lot of feedback, a lot of interpretations, a lot of projections. And some of it will be loving, and some of it will be critical, and some of it will be confused, and some of it will be insightful. And your job is not to manage all of it, not to make sure everyone sees you correctly, not to defend yourself against every misperception. Your job is to stay connected to your own center, to your own truth, to your own process, and to let the feedback move through you, taking what serves and releasing what doesn't. And that's a practice. It's not something you get right once, and then you're done. It's something you do over and over, in conversation after conversation, in relationship after relationship, learning each time a little more about where you end and where the other person's projection begins. And here's what's interesting. As you get better at this, as you get more skilled at holding your center while remaining open, something shifts in the quality of the projections you receive. It's as if, by not collapsing into them, by not taking them on as your identity, you actually help the other person see you more clearly. Not immediately, not in that conversation, but over time, because you're not confirming their projection. You're not playing the role they've cast you in, and so their projection doesn't stick. It slides off, and eventually, if they're paying attention, if they're willing to see, they start to notice the gap between who they thought you were and who you actually are. And that gap can be an invitation for them to look more closely, to see more truly, to relate to you as you are rather than as they imagined you to be. But that only happens if you hold your ground. If you collapse into their projection, you confirm it. And then that becomes the new mask, the new false self that you have to maintain. So in a strange way, being misunderstood, being projected onto, is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to practice self-knowing, to practice discernment, to practice staying true to yourself in the face of others' interpretations. And it's also an opportunity to let others have their own process, their own journey of seeing and not seeing, their own timeline for recognizing who you actually are. You don't have to force it. You don't have to convince them. You just have to be yourself, consistently, patiently, and trust that those who are meant to see you will see you, and those who aren't ready won't, and both of those outcomes are okay. The fifth sign is that you're starting to feel a strange kind of relief in being misunderstood, almost as if the misunderstanding is proof that you're finally being real. This is paradoxical, and it doesn't make logical sense, but if you're in this process, you'll know exactly what I mean. There's a way that being understood, being approved of, being seen as good or right or acceptable can actually feel like a trap when you're in the process of shedding the mask. Because if people understand you, if they approve of you, there's a part of you that wonders whether you're still performing, whether you're still adjusting yourself to fit their expectations, whether you're still wearing a mask, even if it's a slightly different mask than before. But when you're misunderstood, when people are confused by you or critical of you, or just can't quite figure you out, there's a strange freedom in that. It's evidence that you're not performing anymore, that you're not managing their perception, that you're just being yourself and letting the chips fall where they may. This relief is subtle. It's not a loud celebration. It's more like a quiet exhale, a sense of finally, I can stop trying so hard. And it often comes mixed with other feelings, with sadness or loneliness or fear. But underneath those other feelings, there's this thread of relief, this sense that you're finally off the hook, finally released from the exhausting job of making sure everyone is comfortable with who you are. And that release is its own kind of homecoming. It's a return to yourself, to the part of you that existed before you learned to perform, before you learned to adjust, before you learned to read the room and modulate your energy to match it. It's a return of the child who just expressed, who just felt without filtering everything through the question of how it would be received. Of course, you can't actually go back to being that child. You have adult responsibilities, adult complexities, adult awareness of consequences and impacts. But you can reclaim some of that child's unself-consciousness, some of that freedom to just be without constant self-monitoring. And that reclamation often begins with the willingness to be misunderstood, to let people get it wrong, to stop trying to control the narrative of who you are in others' minds. It's a radical act of trust, not in others, but in yourself. It's trusting that you can know who you are independent of whether anyone else knows who you are. It's trusting that your worth, your value, your realness doesn't depend on being seen accurately by others. It depends only on being seen accurately by yourself. And this is where the spiritual dimension of this process becomes clear, because what you're really doing, what this whole journey of shedding the mask is really about, is learning to see yourself the way the deeper self sees you, the way the soul sees you, the way whatever you want to call the organizing principle of your life sees you. And that seeing is not based on performance or achievement or approval. It's based on essence, on a unique pattern of who you are, on the gift that only you can bring into the world. And that gift doesn't need to be understood to be valuable. It doesn't need to be celebrated to be real. It just needs to be expressed, to be lived, to be offered. And the offering itself is the point, not the reception. Jung wrote about the importance of living your own myth, of discovering the unique story that wants to unfold through your life, rather than living out someone else's story or the collective story. And living your own myth means, by definition, that you're going to be incomprehensible to people who are living different myths, who are following different patterns, who are animated by different organizing principles. And that's not a problem. That's the nature of individuality. We're each living our own unique expression of consciousness, and those expressions are as varied as human beings are varied. And the more you step into your own myth, your own pattern, your own unique way of being, the less you're going to fit into anyone else's categories or expectations. And that's when the real freedom begins. That's when you stop living for approval and start living for expression. That's when you stop asking, am I doing this right? And start asking, is this true to me? In that shift, that reorientation from external validation to internal alignment, is the shift from persona to self, from mask to face, from performance to presence. So if you're feeling that strange relief in being misunderstood, honor it. Don't dismiss it as bitterness or defensiveness or a failure to communicate. Recognize it as a sign that you're finally letting go, finally trusting yourself, finally allowing yourself to be seen or not seen without needing to control the outcome. And notice what happens in your body when you let go in this way. Notice the softening, the opening, the sense of space that wasn't there before. That's the space of your actual self, the self that's been waiting underneath the mask all along, patient, quiet, ready to emerge as soon as you were willing to stop performing. The sixth sign, and this one weaves through all the others, is that you're starting to notice who doesn't misunderstand you, and those people are becoming more precious, more significant, more essential to your sense of being truly seen. Not everyone is confused by the new you. Not everyone is projecting onto you or relating to an old version of you or struggling to make sense of your choices. There are a few people, maybe only one or two, maybe a small handful, who seem to see you clearly even as you're changing, who seem to recognize you even as you're becoming less recognizable to others. These are the people who respond to your silence with their own silence, who meet your depth with their own depth, who don't need you to explain or justify or perform. They just see you. And being seen by them feels completely different from being understood by people who are still relating to your mask. It feels like recognition, like coming home, like finally you can stop translating and just be. These relationships become your anchor during this transition. They remind you that being real doesn't mean being alone, that shedding the mask doesn't mean losing all connection. It means losing false connection and finding true connection. It means releasing relationships that were based on who you were pretending to be and deepening relationships that are based on who you actually are. And this is a trade worth making, even though it's painful, even though it means letting go of people you care about, even though it means your social circle might get smaller before it gets bigger again. Because the quality of connection you have with people who see you is so much richer, so much more nourishing, so much more real than the quantity of connection you had when you were performing for approval. You might notice that these people who see you are often people who are in their own process of individuation, their own journey of shedding masks and becoming real. They recognize you because they're going through the same thing, because they understand from the inside what it's like to be misunderstood, to be projected onto, to be in that strange liminal space between who you were and who you're becoming. And there's a kind of kinship in that, a sense of we're in this together, even if our specific journeys look different. These are the people you can sit in silence with, and it doesn't feel awkward. These are the people you can say something that doesn't quite make sense, and they don't rush to fix it or interpret it or make it logical. They just let it be. They trust that you're working something out, that you're in process, and they're willing to be present to that process without needing to control or direct it. And as you spend more time with people who see you, you start to learn what real intimacy feels like. Not the kind of intimacy that comes from shared history or shared activities or even shared values, though those things can be part of it. But the kind of intimacy that comes from being willing to be seen in your becoming, in your not knowing, in your messy, unfolding process of growth and change. This is vulnerable in a way that the old relationships weren't, because you're not hiding behind competence or performance or the persona's well-constructed facade. You're just here, raw, real, still figuring it out. And they're here with you, not because you have it all together, but because they recognize something essential in you, something true, something that doesn't need to be polished or perfected to be valuable. Jung talked about the importance of relationship in the individuation process. He said that we can't become ourselves in isolation, that we need the mirror of others to see ourselves clearly, to integrate our shadows, to recognize our projections. But not just any relationship serves this function. It has to be a relationship where both people are committed to seeing truly, to speaking honestly, to holding space for each other's growth without trying to control or fix or save. And those relationships are rare. They require maturity, self-awareness, a willingness to look at your own stuff rather than blaming the other person for triggering you. They require that you've done enough of your own inner work that you're not using the relationship to avoid yourself, but rather to deepen into yourself in the presence of another. So if you're in this process of shedding the mask, pay attention to who's still there, who's still seeing you, who's still able to meet you in the new territory you're exploring. Those are your people. Those are the relationships worth investing in, worth protecting, worth nurturing. And if you don't have those relationships yet, if you're in a phase where you're mostly being misunderstood and you haven't yet found the people who see you, know that they're coming. Know that as you become more yourself, as you stop performing and start being, you naturally start to attract people who are also real, who are also done with masks, who are also looking for depth and authenticity and true connection. It's one of the strange laws of the psyche that attracts that as you individuate, you start to magnetize others who are also individuating. But you have to be willing to go through the loneliness first. You have to be willing to let go of the false connections before the true connections can arrive. And in the meantime, you have yourself. You have your own inner witness, your own capacity to see yourself clearly, to know yourself truly, to be present to your own experience without needing external validation. And that's not a consolation prize. That's the foundation. That's the ground from which all real relationship grows. Because if you can't see yourself, if you can't be present to yourself, if you don't know yourself, then you're always going to be looking to others to tell you who you are. And that's the very dynamic that keeps the mask in place.